So just FYI, this intro can be a little bit emotional. When I was a kid growing up, and maybe you did some of this stuff too, I felt like I caused my mother's terrible feelings, or I felt like I caused her drinking. I felt like I caused her reactions and caused her heavy burdened life by not being a good enough kid. And at a very young age, I would think that I would have the power to change her life and make her happy if I was good. It's like a superhero thing. And we lived in this chaotic, ratty house on the block, which I was deeply ashamed of. So another thing I would do is I would often think that the reason that our house was messy or trashy looking or the lawn was messed up was because I wasn't diligent enough to water it, or somehow fix the big patches of dead spots or the holes in the ground. And I also thought that if I could make all of that happen, then I could be the family hero, which actually is really terrible for kids. And underneath how I was thinking about the lawn, like if I could just make the lawn better, it would change my alcoholic or my messy family system. Like it wouldn't be that anymore if the lawn was nice. Another thing I do to give you some insight on how young children developmentally deal with stress is when my mother would drink and drive with us in the car, which was nearly a daily experience for us. My siblings and I, we would hold on to the passenger side door armrest and pretend to steer the car to compensate for my mother crossing into other lanes, as like wobbling. We'd magically think that the armrest handle on our 83 Buick Skylark was a joystick, like in a spaceship, and we pretend to have some control, magical way to have some control to deal with the terror. If you can't get a visual on what I'm talking about, some of those old car doors would have this armrest handle and a thing that you arm there and you hold on to the thing. And anyway, all of those beliefs are examples of magical or superstitious thinking, and I'm giving them in context of myself as a child before puberty, which is where our brain changes to think more abstractly. During and after puberty, the child is now able to really get that the door handle isn't going to save you, that the lawn isn't going to change, or you don't have the power to change your parents' moods or situations, including your own. But there's a big but here. For childhood trauma survivors, the magical thinking usually carries over into our adulthood, and we need to deal with it in our recovery in some way at some point. At the heart of growing up in childhood trauma it's really to experience developmental delays of all kinds. Some of us can be rock stars at our job performance or functioning, but we have a very underdeveloped mastery over conflict and intimacy. Some of us can be profoundly emotionally intelligent, but we have an undeveloped sense in terms of daily functioning or daily self-care. When I got to therapy, the carry over my childhood magical thinking was the immature survival ideas that I still had, like if I don't feel it, it'll go away. I had a big magical thinking fantasy that a ship was going to come in and somehow rescue me, and it was going to come into my life at some point, like say winning the lottery. I also had magical thinking about that I cause other people's reactions to me, always looking for negative meaning making about why someone maybe didn't get back to me, that it was definitely something I did as opposed to a million other like alternatives of why that happened. So let's get into a little bit about what is magical thinking. By definition, magical thinking is the belief that one's ideas, thoughts, actions, words, or use of symbols can influence the course of events in the material world, like in reality. Just like, say, the car door joystick thing, or the belief that as a 7-year-old that I should be a qualified landscaper or a contractor, or the belief that as a 5-year-old that I should be able to meet my mother's emotional needs like a therapist would. The belief that my thoughts and actions or words are the only factors in why some of my relationships didn't work. Magical thinking is a big topic, and it covers things going into things like superstition, can get into OCD symptoms, anxiety, catastrophizing, neuroticism, forecasting, disaster, like if I can't stop thinking about this horrific thing, it's definitely going to happen today. For our purposes, for me, the magical thinking as a boy is wrapped up in survival, combined with a normal developmental phase of concrete concrete thinking that kids have it safe for. Like a 4-year-old will cognitively be able to accept factually that if you're good, Santa's really going to bring it this year, where older kids might be like, it's a little sketch. Young children are vulnerable to abuse around causation due to that developmental stage. Like if you've ever heard, this is what I mean, if you've ever heard or thought of these as a kid, it's your fault things go wrong. I can't make mom and dad stop fighting. I'm just not interesting enough to make mom spend time with me. You ruined your sister's birthday. Notice how all of those are about explaining events. There are really good reasons why we get stuck developmentally, and it carries this causation meaning making into our adulthood. For example, our inner child pops up when a friend is in distress, and that inner child's going to say, this wouldn't have happened if we hung out with them last week like when they asked us to. So our inner child also says our partner will want to spend more time with us if we are less needy or boring. See how that's around causation, meaning making, concrete thinking, magical thinking. If you're new to me or new to the channel, welcome. If you like this video, feel free to hit some buttons on the screen. You really can't miss with any of the buttons, especially the like button or the subscribe button, which greatly contributes to the community around healing from childhood trauma. And if these videos are helpful to you and helpful to your recovery, you can consider supporting the work that goes into this channel over at my Patreon. I'll have all the links in the description of this video. And in addition, you can also consider joining my monthly membership healing community, which is available through my website. The membership consists of live Q&A sessions with me twice a month on Wednesdays, all access to my childhood trauma work. You'll also receive weekly journaling prompts about the videos and inner child work. And you'll also get the opportunity to connect with other childhood trauma survivors who are working on their recovery. So if you follow up with this little white ball up here, you can learn all about the recurring membership. Also on my website, you can check out an upcoming webinar that I have coming up on Saturday, August 6, 2022, which is going to be on the topic of navigating family cutoffs. So here are 4 examples of childhood-based magical thinking. I'll define each one as well as give examples about how it might have originated in childhood and how it manifests in our adult lives. As a side note, magical thinking is really akin to denial, but magical thinking usually is a way to explain the denial that we're not kind of privy to, like in a subconscious way. The second side note is we will look at these from the lens of a child surviving an unsafe family system, not from a place of harsh judgment about why we might do these things. So let's get into it. Number one. Number one is if I ignore it, it will go away and resolve without action. It's really like blind optimism. This might be the most significant one on the list. When children aren't getting any help with abuse emotions ranging from neglect to physical abuse, a good strategy is to not get slowed down by feeling about the problem or the problem itself. Some examples. A child in the middle of a divorce stops feeling the big feelings about it and pretends it's not real, and the parents will just work it out. Another example is a child with a parent with substance abuse problems thinking that this time, this birthday, this family event will be the one that the parent is sober for. Another is a neglected child not being prepared for a school assignment and casually comes up with the idea that the teacher will help them with start their science project at recess. The day that it's due is an example of magical thinking. Another is a child deciding that they're fine after like a horrific domestic violence situation seen at home, and that they're just going to be happy from now on for mom and dad. While denial and repression are really good strategies for kids who aren't getting any help or healthy parenting, this is a huge logic fallacy that I see as a major problem, perhaps to humanity, is I tell clients that unfortunately, trauma always has a way to bite us in the ass in our adulthood. We might think we can put it away or decide to move on from it. Here are some examples of how magical thinking might carry over into our adulthood. Adult survivors can engage in magical thinking or ignoring their relationship problems and ignoring their feelings of, say, a disconnected, unhappy marriage until it's too late. The magical thinking is just like childhood. Ignore the problems and maybe the thing will work out on its own. Another is adult survivors can have dismissive magical thinking about dysfunctional or abusive family members or partners or, say, friends, where we ignore that dad or mom or a sibling or a partner acts out at every important life event for us, like graduations or weddings. Adult survivors can also ignore medical problems, thinking that they'll just go away. And I always wonder about extreme neglect in that person's childhood when I hear stories that they ignored something till it was too late. And I also wonder, what did their parents model for them about addressing problems and self-care? Another is adult survivors can definitely ignore stressful events or life situations and really become detached from the emotions, like kind of go into a mode or automatic pilot, like, I'm not here, this isn't happening, in the middle of a heated conflict between two friends. So take note here how the adult dysfunction examples are rooted in childhood trauma survival. In these examples that I've given here, there is usually crossover into things like codependency and dissociation. Like, you have to be a little bit dissociated to ignore major health problems or abusive people close to us. And we can also keep those dysfunctional relationships going by magical thinking, which is really one of the main ingredients to our trauma-based codependency. So that's the first one. Moving on to the second one is what I'm calling anxiety management-based magical thinking. Children have an amazing imagination, and ideally, healthy parents can foster that imagination, but also help our children deal with fear from a place of comfort in a way to deal with reality. Like, who remembers like jumping up onto your bed because you didn't want the monster to grab your feet? Like, that's an opportunity for parents to battle magical thinking through connecting with them, but unfortunately that doesn't happen enough. And another example is a child hears, say, their parents wonder about, say, this is really specific, like a child hears their parents wonder about a gas leak coming from the stove, and without discussions around safety or reassuring the kids or explaining to them how it all works, it's not safe to ask the adults questions. The child might become hypervigilant or obsessed with gas leaks, especially if other abuse is going on, not trusting the adults to take care of things. That's like the beginning of obsessive compulsive thinking in some ways. And obsessing is really about safety and age-appropriate black and white thinking. Gas clearly equals death and explosion, not the reality that gas stoves sometimes smell when we cook things. So another example is a child will start to engage in patterns, like a rabbit's foot keychain in their pocket means that the older sibling doesn't get hit that day or kicked out of the house by mom, or making their bed that one day is why dad came back after threatening divorce to mom. That's some of those examples. Another example is a child might learn from a parent that keeping the house immaculate as a coping skill makes everything better when it comes to things outside the parent's control, rather than processing and helping the child about things outside their control or outside of the family situation. A child might also learn on their own or from their parent about ideas around contamination, magical thinking around contamination, like Aunt Betty ruined our family when she moved in, or silverware at restaurants will 100% make you sick, that's why mom brings her own, or it's not dad's gambling problem, things went downhill when he inherited grandma's Hummel collection, and they're cursed. So ideas around like that, like something happened that contaminates things. Notice on all of these how they have a quality of explaining reality in magical ways as a way to survive or navigate stress and anxiety about reality. And again, for abused children, the magical thinking is a way to have some power over the anxiety, because reality has made those kids powerless because they're not getting any help from mom and dad. Here are some ways the anxiety-based magical thinking translates into our adulthoods and, say, teens. An adult survivor may develop obsessive compulsive issues, need of rituals, issues with ambiguity, issues with control for safety, issues fearing one's own thoughts. And OCD and similar disorders are complex. And I'm not solely assigning them to childhood trauma, but I am saying it can come from childhood trauma if there is a trauma history there for the individual. Another example is adult survivors can engage in anxiety-based superstitious thinking that doesn't serve them, or it kind of gets them into trouble as taking, say, fundamentalist religious ideas or New Age spirituality in a literal sense and ignoring their psychological problems, things like hypervigilance or safety problems like fawning or codependency. What that looks like is like, if I don't pray today, bad things are going to happen. If I don't have my crystal with me, my partner will hit me again. Magical thinking taken to the literal sense. Another example is adult survivors can become incredibly controlling of their environment in terms of cleanliness. Or I've even had clients that need to see the restaurant layout before their date that day as a way to manage anxiety or the ambiguity, to kind of have like a game plan. Adult survivors can also anxiously have magical thinking around contamination, whether that's about health or about social situations, like you being around others might ruin their experience for them, or vice versa, them being around you might ruin it for you. The third one is what I'm simply calling clairvoyance. This one is related to the others, and it's kind of an odd one. The clairvoyant piece to magical thinking is we get confirmation on an anxiety or a fear that comes, if it comes true, and the person now assumes that they can predict such events. What this looks like is like a parent might say, I knew I needed to be out of the house the day the dog got hit by a car out front. I just knew I couldn't be home. A child might hear the parent engage in that kind of level of magical thinking, which is really terrible modeling about reality. I knew your father would be a bad parent, but I knew that there was some greater purpose to being with him. Another example is a child might become really freaked out when they see their own fears and anxieties come true, or in small or big ways. And now they have to deal with the new fear of being clairvoyant themselves. Like, the responsibility of that is kind of like a superpower, but it's not real. I'm not dismissing our intuition or even dismissing those who are really true mediums in there, but let's actually leave the clairvoyance to them. Often in abusive family systems, parents who declare that they can predict the future are coming from a highly grandiose or egoic place or a self-serving place. They can even be highly manipulative around that stuff. Like, don't you ever think that I don't know what you're thinking? It's like such a mind F, right? Moving to the adult piece with this one, adult survivors can learn to become extremely anxious around fears of predicting, which in most cases, again, comes from the parents declaring that they have such superpowers. Like, the wise adage of feelings aren't facts are too foreign to these adult survivors, unfortunately. Another example is adult survivors can be vulnerable to this kind of magical thinking and can codependently test an abusive partner. Like, if they call me back, it confirmed my vision that they really want to do this relationship with me and work it out just like I dreamed about last night. You see how that's both magical thinking and predicting and that kind of a thing? There's a lot of Lord of the Rings or X-Men type superpowers wrapped up with this one, and it gets people into a lot of emotional trouble if they make immature decisions. So the final one, the fourth one, is what I'm calling rescue-based magical thinking. The last one is near and dear to me because my mother would perpetually live in this fantasy of when her ship would come in that it would usually come in the form of a man who had resources. And rescue-based magical thinking is really hedging bets for rescues in the form of, say, winning the lottery, like I mentioned, or finding ourselves in a magical relationship, or being in a relationship but having this wild fantasy that the person we're in a relationship with becomes like having a fairy tale level of commitment and love for you instead of just reality-based intimacy. That's totally a Disney inner child thing that a lot of us do. And rescue-based magical thinking can also look like geographical cures. Like, if I move to New York, my life will finally be cool and it'll be complete even though I can't afford the rent and I don't have a job. Rescue-based magical thinking can also look like fantasizing about going back to school or owning a house under the idea that it will just happen somehow instead of the slog of footwork or the incredible luck in housing to make that happen. I think I just probably contradicted the whole video about magical thinking, but whatever. The housing crisis is real. And it's there, and that's a reality, but I think you get what I'm sort of saying. But that last one is really about, you've heard people in your family say immature fantasies, and the person is totally removed from the reality that they need to do a lot of heavy lifting to better their circumstance or better their relationships or job or housing. A child will come up with their own rescue fantasies. Like, raise your hand out there if you've ever wanted to be adopted by your friend's family because they just seem saner or healthier or more loving. You know, and a child could be raised with parents that live in rescue-based reality themselves. A child could see their parents go from riches to rags, and the family solely identifies with that tragedy, and they all live in this fantasy or kind of trying to scheme to get that sort of level of affluence back. In adult survivors, now we're going to the adult, like how it manifests in adulthood piece. Adult survivors can engage in rescue-based magical thinking, especially around romantic partnerships. That once you've got one, it's all smooth sailing for the rest of your life. This is a sign to me about attachment-based trauma. And it's not so much that we have the relationship, it's like the inner child thinks they now have a parent that's going to take care of them. Adult survivors can perpetually put off going for better education or jobs or housing or relationships under the assumption that they just happen one day, that they will fall into our laps. Adult survivors can look to others who are more successful in some ways and assume that the house or the job or the relationship just fell into their lap without really knowing the person. And lastly, adult survivors, this is a big one. They will attribute their mistakes as stuck places that they will have to live in now forever, instead of having a process or flow in their life, like a bad marriage is forever, instead of getting out of it, or a poor career chase is forever, or your education choices are now forever. In these cases, and I get that this is nuanced, it's like there will never be a rescue, but all these cases dismiss the reality flow and process to our lives. Marriages, jobs, education, finances, and change. And what I'm trying to say there, some of us think it's going to fall into our lap, and some of us think it's never going to happen. Both are qualities of magical thinking. So what to do about all this? Here are some recommendations of doing some personal writing, some journal writing for your recovery. The first is, notice the ways that you might have subtle or big ways of having magical thinking, and try to write them down. The next is, go through these 4 categories that I've given and make some notes and to see if they apply to you and why. Try to be specific in all of these. How might they be rooted in your childhood for you? Try to be specific. Your inner adult, which is the part that we're trying to really get more in shape with these videos, can start to call out these things for what they are. It doesn't mean that you're going to immediately stop engaging with them, but it is a start. And can you start to see the magical thinking as a way to survive versus dealing with reality in childhood? Like, if you struggle with obsessive thoughts, instead of hating that you do, or that you hating that you're exhausted, because they are exhausting, can you reframe all those that they were there for a really good reason because of childhood, but they don't really work anymore? So those are some writing prompts. And you can also consider joining my monthly healing community as I send out more specific journaling prompts on each of the videos that I put out. Lastly, I think the biggest takeaway that I really want you to kind of embrace is the idea that, of course, you have some magical thinking going on, because in childhood, you really had no help dealing with this kind of nightmare that you were going through. And the way that you came up with magical thinking was to actually have some power over like the disreality that you were in. So it's like you brought some magic into it and that kept you going. I want you to think about it that way instead of just blaming yourself for having these things going on. So I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments about magical thinking, if it resonates with you and what your ideas are. And as always, may you be filled with loving kindness. May you be well. May you be peaceful and at ease, and may you be joyous. And I will see you next time.